So on this episode of the podcast, we are inviting on Kyle Higgins. Kyle Higgins is an award-winning filmmaker of the comic book world, a #1 New York Times bestselling author, best known for his long-running work on DC Comics Batman titles Nightwing, Batman Eternal, Gates of Gotham, Batman Beyond 2.0, as well as his critically acclaimed reinvention of the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers for Boom Studios and Saban Hasbro, which included the Battle for the Grid video game and a live-action prelude to his 25th anniversary comic book event, Shattered Grid, which he also produced and directed. At present, Kyle's writing several creator-owned series, including an original sci-fi graphic novel called The Trap, the sci-fi fantasy action epic Ordinary Gods, as well as his critically acclaimed original superhero series, Radiant Black. So Kyle Higgins.
Yes.
Comic book writer.
Sometimes.
What do you think of our hot take in terms of are comic books dead? Like the current state of comic books, are they dead?
I think hot takes are what are a huge problem of our society. So I appreciate you starting with the most reductive statement in question. The answer is no, they're not dead, but I'm not supposed to extrapolate yet. So
welcome to the Deep Chat.
All right. And then is there a future in the comic book industry in terms of growth? That's
yes.
Kind of the other half of the hot take.
Well,
yes.
In terms of growth, again, that's so open-ended, but yes. All that being said, I mean, I have opinions about growth and desire for scalability as far as I don't think everything has to scale industry-wise. I'm not even talking about comics. I'm specifically talking just kind of in our society. But if you're like, we're putting a gun to my head, does the industry have room to grow or will it grow? Yes, it could look different. But this year alone is a banner year in the industry. I mean, this is like probably been the biggest year in the last probably 6 or 7 years. And 2020 was really big as well. I mean, Publishers Weekly. Well, anyway, we can get into all that, but
yeah, it's time. So that's basically what we want to talk about now. What's the current state of the industry? What's a high-selling comic? What's a low-selling comic? Just, give us some edges to work with.
Well, how much context do you want here? Because if you're this is the thing. Like, if you're gonna start with the hot take, I feel like we need to unpack why you're even asking that.
Well, I would say it's because there's a perception of that.
From who?
People who are maybe not as central to the comics industry as you.
Uh-huh. So here's my always been my issue with things like that. Just because comics in this particular instance don't touch your day-to-day life in the same way that they may have when you were buying them at the grocery store because they were visible right then and there at, as impulse buys in the checkout aisle. Which, you guys are a little older than me, but I know we all went to Omni growing up. Come on. The Superstore, right?
That's a good point. Yeah. I do remember we would always try not to get the ones with the barcodes on them. Right?
But like that, yeah. So like that being said, though, I'm looking at numbers right now, just purely from North American comic sales. These are through ICV2 from 2020 alone. And it's a 1.28 billion in sales in 2020, 1.21 billion in sales in 2019, 1.095 billion in 2018. There's a climb there. As far as an industry unto itself, you might look at that and go, well, 1.2 billion, that's nothing. But again, through what lens are you looking at it through? Like, what is your metric for success and desirable size? And I think we often look at these different mediums, for example, and we are assigning a value to them or a perceived value based on our perception of what, say, popular entertainment looks like in our day-to-day life. If you're talking about are comics dead and you talk about like, well, is that a perception? Okay, well, let's drill down on that for a second. Because are you asking about the medium? Are you asking about the format of the medium, the monthly periodical? Are you talking about comics as an industry? And all of those things there's different levels of an answer that, we could unpack as far as where things sit. But yes, I would say that they are very much around, and particularly coming out of where we are now or going into where we're about to be going with things like the metaverse and all the crypto stuff that I don't even want to talk about. We are looking at a really interesting thing that I think is happening. Much like you saw vinyl have a kind of resurgence from the standpoint of a listening experience, a collectability, a nostalgic angle. However, I mean, there's all those different components. From the collector standpoint, physical collecting is still something that is very prevalent. And I would say in the last few years in particular, it has been ballooning that much more. You know, I do a lot of conventions each year. I do between like 10 to 15 comic conventions. And just looking at the desire for things like CGC. The CGC stands for, well, actually, I don't know what it stands for. It's basically grading. They grade the comic, you know, the corners, the paper quality, wrinkles, things like that.
Scale of 1 to 10, right?
Yeah, but like you're never getting a 10. Like a 9.8 is what a 10 has to be like. I don't even know if they've done a 10. They probably have, but it has to come straight from the printer and like it has never been touched, like has never been like unsealed from the printer. That's kind of your only shot at a 10. But 9.8s are really, really desirable. But basically, it's like the trading card industry, the sports card industry. And I mean, are you guys familiar with how much that has kind of been exploding during COVID?
Yes, and also because of NFTs as well. Like those.
Well, but that's a whole other part. I'm not even talking about those. That's a whole other conversation.
But just in general, the physical trading cards and comics have exploded in terms of
collectability. I mean, you're talking also about different tiers of scarcity, depending on how a publisher or creators handle covers on their book. You have things like incentive covers where, you know, a 1 in 10 cover or 1 in 25 or 1 in 50, which means for every 50 copies of that monthly periodical, that, you know, $3.99 issue, a store has to order 50 copies to get 1 copy of this rarer cover. And then they typically upsell that. But because it's rarer, it goes for more. In some ways, probably a little bit of there's a bubble with speculation. We saw it in the 90s to, you know, a hugely detrimental effect in the industry.
Were you talking about like when you had the Todd McFarlane 17 different covers and
holograms and foil?
Image in 1992 was a continuation of what Marvel was doing, and then everything just kind of continually ramped for several years. And when you have X-Men #1, it's like 6 million copies, the Chris Claremont and Jim Lee X-Men #1. And a lot of stores bought really heavy. I mean, you can find that book in quarter bins today, like aplenty. Like there are stores that have boxes of that book still sitting in back. It was the speculation of, I can put my kids through college with this new #1. But when that kind of speculation drives a print run up to 6 million copies, there's a lot of that copy. So it's not valuable in a collectible way because there's so much of it.
Sure.
But that era and those types of things that were happening ultimately led to why we have, up through the pandemic, only one distributor. Marvel had doubled down on their own distribution, not doubled down, but they had started their own distribution network. I believe it was called Heroes World. And so then when Marvel went bankrupt in the mid-90s, it had a big cascading effect.
In the 90s, we also started to see the cross-promotion with comic book movies, because it wasn't really until, 89 when Batman became the first real blockbuster comic book movie. And
I think Richard Donner and Christopher Reeve would have something to say about that.
Wow, you're right. That's right. I forgot about Superman, but it was the first one that for me felt a little bit more like a blockbuster. Whereas when I look back on those Superman movies, they feel a little bit hokey, even though they were really good. I know you're gonna defend that, but
no, I mean that's subjective. I mean you're wrong, but
Exactly.
But it's all subjective.
So have we seen a cross promotion with comics? Has comics increased in your opinion, or with data? Has it increased since we've started to see this influx of comic book movies, especially in the last 15 years since Iron Man? Marvel really has succeeded.
That's an interesting question, and it's in some ways way above my pay grade. It's a complicated question because there are several different factors that go into play with something like this, and we'll try to unpack them all here if I can kind of keep my head straight. But what you're talking about specifically is in regards to what type of comic books, Brad?
Well, in general, the entire industry as a whole, because I like the numbers that you cited earlier.
No. What type of comic books and comic book movies are you talking about?
When you say type, give me the categories.
Well, exactly. So that's the other thing. Comic books are not a genre. Comic books are a medium. I'm not saying that you're implying that they're a genre, but what I'm saying is that, you know, when someone asks me what my favorite comic book movie is, I am honest. Road to Perdition is my favorite comic book movie.
Loved it. One of my all-time favorites, yes.
Paul Newman, Tom Hanks. It's Sam Mendes' second film after American Beauty, shot by the late Conrad Hall. It's an adaptation of Max Allan Collins. I don't remember if it was actually a graphic novel or a collected edition. I actually believe it was a graphic novel, Road to Perdition.
Most people don't know that was based on a graphic novel or a comic book. I can't remember which either, but most people don't know that.
But the reason that I'm kind of drilling down on that is because what we're really talking about here when we're talking about movies is we're talking about superhero comics in that regard. You know, it's always kind of boggled my mind a little bit that there wasn't more direct connection between the billion-dollar box office movie and the collected edition sales. And so just to parse terms for a second here. So when I say graphic novel or I say collected edition, those terms get thrown around as being the same thing, and they're not. It's a term that came about in the 80s and really, well, I don't know if it was actually in the 80s, but it came after things like Sandman and the more kind of literary lens that a lot of comics post really 86 started kind of being filtered through with the British invasion and Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman and everyone. But what it actually is referring to is publication form. What most people refer to as a graphic novel is just a collected edition. It takes prior iterations of a story. So if it's a 6-issue story that came out as monthly periodicals, which are called comic books, floppies we call them, and then it's going to collect those into a 120-page book, that is actually a collected edition because it came out, it is collecting a prior printing. And the story was designed for basically, you know, it's serialized, like it's chapter breaks, monthly comics. A graphic novel is different. It's a different reading experience, and it's designed for a single reading experience. It's like the difference between a TV show and a movie. The other thing, though, with a graphic novel is that traditionally, because it's not collecting something that was prior printed up until the last few years, and now the book market doesn't really seem to care, but there was at least the perception of desirability in the book market for stories that were only coming out as a graphic novel and had not come out as monthly floppies, which is why they kind of classify as a graphic novel. Does that make sense? So,
yeah. So as a writer, do you approach the two different?
Very differently, yeah. I mean, the way I like to talk about it is, well, you and I have talked about this probably over the years, but like, it's just, again, using the film versus a TV show as an example. Like, I tell people, like, say you're building a car, do you want your car to go 0 to 60 in 4 seconds, or do you want it to last 200,000 miles? Because those are very different engines, and you have to build accordingly. And so building something as an ongoing series, like a comic, the story structure, muscles, and engines that you lean on to create the impression of a satisfying narrative conclusion while also momentum and propulsion into continuing the story, you're constructing things differently than you would for a single reading experience where even if someone were to break it up, it's still designed as one story that, you know, probably ends. And you could do future volumes, but that's like doing a sequel to a movie. You kind of have to reinvent a lot of times well, unless you're, well, that's a whole other thing. Commentary on blockbuster movies. But so yes, I think about them differently. Yeah.
Well, let's do a real world example here. Kyle, you have a comic called Radiant Black. That is a floppy ongoing series that also has a collected version, which, you know, collection volume 1, volume 2, I believe are out. And then a graphic novel. Give me an example of an explicit graphic novel then.
Mouse.
Lock and Key or?
No, because Lock and Key came out as monthlies. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. You can dress it up as much as you want, but it's as far as the collected edition and what it looks like. But like, if it's designed as a serialized monthly release, it's not, the collection is not a graphic novel. And maybe I'm being I know I'm being very literal there, but like, these things matter. And not only from a reading experience, but also from a sales, a marketing experience, or even just like how you approach things. If you're doing something as a graphic novel, and like I'm working on one right now, it's tied to Radiant Black. Well, in that we are doing a big crossover right now, but it's called Inferno Girl Red. And it was an original graphic novel that we kickstarted earlier this year. Did very well. This was also after another Kickstarter I ran for an original graphic novel called The Trap, which I just got off to the printer. So with Inferno Girl Red, for example, we are going to be putting that book out, the softcover version of the graphic novel, with Image Comics. We're looking at some different kind of potentially new ways of serializing it, which technically would, in my opinion, take it out of being a graphic novel if it comes out in a serialized form first. But narratively, it's designed and it has these kind of chapter breaks in it. Anyway, the point is, we are looking at the book market right now, and you have to solicit 6 months earlier in the book market than you do in the direct market. And the direct market is roughly several thousand independent comic book stores that are the backbone of the comic book industry. They're brick and mortar stones. They're all they're mostly independently run.
Let me stop there for a second. So graphic novels can go into bookstores that not just comic book shops, right? And that's the difference here, is that you might be selling directly to like Barnes and Noble or who, Well,
you would do that with the collected edition as well. What I was trying to say before was that up until recently, in the last few years anyway, the perception, and I'm not necessarily saying it was reality, but the perception was the book market, Barnes and Noble, etc. The book market prioritized and wanted and would give better placement to original graphic novels that were not just collecting a prior comic book series or comic book monthly release. Again, it's a perception thing. It's the slight pinky out, like a graphic novel sounds better to say than a comic book or a collected edition.
Now, I think I can offer a little bit of insight because I've written before here. I know that most people probably wouldn't care what the difference is between collected or graphic novels, most people. But when you're writing as a writer, it really is a different experience thinking about the totality of the story, and it all comes out at once in the reading experience than if you are writing a serialized monthly. I would approach it differently.
I'll tell you.
I suspect that's true for you.
Yeah, but I would say the difference is, and it matters from a financial standpoint as well. I mean, because they're different models. An original graphic novel, if you're doing something that's roughly between 90 to 120 pages, somewhere in there, you are putting that out. And sure, you can put it out through the direct market as well, through comic book stores. You would, and the book market at the same time. But whatever it does there is what it does. Whereas if you were to tell a story, and again, it has to be the story has to lend itself to this. I mean, like Matt's story made sense for Inferno Girl Red as a graphic novel, whereas Radiant Black makes more sense as a serialized ongoing comic series. Now, the thing that I'm able to do with Radiant Black, though, then means that we are putting out a 32-page comic floppy every month for $3.99 through the direct market, through all of the comic book stores, through Comixology for digital releases, through even doing conventions, things like that. And so that is money that comes in. And once there are 6 issues out and we collect it in that same 120-page, container format, now we sell that collected edition through the direct market, but also through comic stores. And now that is a second bite at the apple of monetizing the story. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's your business model. The business model is a little bit harder to close on a graphic novel because you've got a lot more upfront risk.
Exactly, yeah. Just to dive back to, because we didn't really answer your question about movies and what I was starting to say about movie theaters. Like, it's always been interesting to me that and it's always tricky. I don't want to say it's politics, but like, oftentimes the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. And the fact that it has gotten better with Marvel in particular being able to kind of, and I don't even know if it's Marvel, I don't know how it works with places like AMC and things like that, but like getting collected editions or even just adaptations that they do comics-wise into movie theaters seems like such a no-brainer, right? Like you come out of Avengers or Spider-Man No Way Home and there's a collection of Spider-Man collected editions or sometimes graphic novels. There's been some Spider-Man graphic novels over the years.
Yeah, it seems like the hugest lost opportunity.
I don't really understand all of the dynamics other than to say that it's very complicated. Like, for example, for years, you hear about people who think they know everything and think, well, I can come and fix an industry that I don't actually work in, but, I'm gonna have an opinion here. They go like, well, why aren't comics in Walmart? Like, save your industry. You know how much Walmart does in sales every year? You know how many people come through Walmart? Like, why get comics in Walmart? We heard that for years and years and years and years and years. Sure, that's desirable, but you know what else is desirable? Literally every square foot in a Walmart store, every single thing in a retail store is slotted and allotted for and priced accordingly based on like how much they think you're going to move by taking up this much space. To break into something like that was really, it just didn't happen until DC did it. And they created original stories that you could only get at a Walmart store. Now that pissed off the direct market, all the comic book stores, because they're going, what the hell? Like, so we can't sell this stuff that's desirable. Now you're drawing customers to Walmart rather than to our stores. Like we are the backbone of the industry. And so then it became like, okay, well, how are they going to collect these stories? I mean, there were comic book stores, there were store owners driving to Walmart and buying the comics at Walmart so that they could then upsell and sell them at the comic book store. Or not even necessarily upsell. But the point is, though, like the kiosk at Walmart that had these books, I mean, good luck finding it. From store to store, like it was a tiny little thing in an aisle right before checkout, or like 3 aisles before checkout, or whatever, wherever, or sometimes it was off in another part of the store. And I don't know how it did financially. I think I got some royalties actually because they reprinted some of my Nightwing and Batman work. But anyway, it's like there's more complicating factors there. You know, Walmart would have to want the stuff in this instance, right? I'm not saying movie theaters don't want the books, but you know, I don't know. I mean, look at what they charge for popcorn and candy, because that's where they make their money, is in that profit margin.
Well, Kyle brought up a good point.
Yeah.
Also, Kyle brought up a good point about stories. Kyle, what was it about Batman?
Well, just observing that when the Nolan films came out, if you were excited about Batman, you went to a comic book store, you would find that Bruce Wayne was dead at the time.
I know where you're going with that, and it makes sense. But what is driving these characters then? Are we letting the film adaptation drive the characters and the creative, or are the comics creating the stories that the films then are able to adapt because the comic did it first and took the chance, and if it worked? For everything Marvel did a few years ago, as far as like replacing all their characters with new characters, there was a huge uproar about this kind of on social media and things like that, and much larger conversations about diversity. That's a whole other, I don't remember what the Marvel Initiative was called, but this was a couple years ago now. But what we got out of it was this incredible Jane Foster Thor run that now Marvel is going to go make the next $1 billion movie Thor film based on. So it's like, even looking at the comics as R&D, if you're a studio, like, makes more sense than I think often how DC looks at things. So yeah, it's interesting. Like, I can share a little story. So when I was doing Nightwing for the New 52, one of the things that Dan DiDio and I would talk about numerous times was the costume color of Nightwing. They changed his color to red from blue, which it had been for 20 years. And I know that doesn't sound like a big thing, but in an industry where, in a medium where so much of it is built on not just legacy, more importantly, visual identity, like iconography. And when you have different artists, it's not like in film or TV where you have an actor's performance or an actor's face to kind of anchor changes. In comics, like, every artist draws Dick Grayson differently. The thing that connects them typically is the costume, so that you feel like, oh, it's still the same character. And so at that point in time, they were rebooting the whole company for the New 52, and it was a really, really bold, ambitious thing they were doing that, you know, I was a part of. And so my thing though was like, okay, you've made Nightwing red and black, now he looks like every other Bat character. He looks like Robin, he looks like Batman Beyond, he looks like Batwoman, he looks like Red Robin. Like, I don't know, when I look at him, he's no longer unique. One of the things that Dan said once, that because we almost changed it to blue because there were story reasons for it as well, and there were other people at the company who wanted it blue as well, it wasn't just me, and it didn't happen. And so I was talking to Dan about why it didn't happen, and he said, and I brought up, I was like, look, he's blue in the Injustice game that just came out, he's blue here, here, and here. And Dan's point was, sure, but are we going to take our cues from the adaptations, or are we going to drive forward and create the new stuff that they take their cues from, so that they take their cues from us? And it was like, okay, I get that. I don't agree in this instance, but I understand and appreciate and respect that position and that approach. That said, over the years, like they have tried to tie things in subtler ways, even just down to like focus on which characters are important. So like when Guardians of the Galaxy, when they were putting the movie together and it was becoming clear and clear, like, hey, this is a big focus for Marvel, the Marvel cosmic side. On the publishing side, then, what did they do? They started prioritizing those properties and building them out in the comics side of Marvel. And that they were prioritizing it because they put their biggest writer, Brian Michael Bendis, on it to kind of reinvent or relaunch Guardians of the Galaxy. So they put a lot of resources, expensive talent on it in order to kind of build it out. And then they, some of the things, like some of the Star-Lord design was influenced by where the movie took things. I mean, Nick Fury in the Marvel comics now is this Nick Fury's son now? They did a thing so that the Nick Fury in the comics is, a way more direct, he's black. He's a way more direct connect to Samuel L. Jackson and the Nick Fury that,
right.
Millions of people see on the screen.
Well, let me point something out here. So what you've illustrated, and I really like this approach, is that you illustrated one where the comic book influenced the movie, which is the Thor being a female, right? And so that the comic book was first and influenced the movie. And then on the other end, now you're talking about how Marvel clearly saw that with Guardians of the Galaxy, they had a hit and decided to have the movie influence the comic. And then there's also the Nick Fury, that was the movie influencing the comic. So it's not really necessarily cross-promotion as it is linking them together loosely so that they can tell compelling stories on both sides that have some connection.
Yeah, and then usually, they'll collect stories that are Marvel and DC will anyway. And then this is actually going to be really fun because, like, I'll say this and then I think this actually could segue us into the whole other side of things, which is the creator-owned side of comics. But as far as like corporate comics, big two comics, licensed comics, like however you want to look at it. Yeah, like when a movie comes out, like or actually this is a good example, when WandaVision for Disney Plus, and it was the first Disney Plus show with the, big Marvel Studios production budgets and everything. I got a box at my door from Marvel, and it was, a couple comp copies of a new collected edition about Scarlet Witch and the Vision. And it was collecting a story that Alex Siegel and I had written when we were first starting our careers, like 10 years ago. Yeah, and it was a reimagining of the Vision's origin. And so they were collecting that with like 2 or 3 other kind of seminal Vision stories because they wanted to get it out when the show is out. I've done a lot of big two comics, like big, and then Power Rangers wasn't big two, but it's in the same space as work for hire, like superhero books. And I'm really proud of a lot of the stuff I've done, but also it's always tricky when you know what you're signing up for when you are going to play in someone else's sandbox. Like, you're not going to own what you build and create. I'm at a point in my career now where it's important to me. And so the stuff that I focus
owning what
on
you
now,
create, right? Owning what you create is more important. Yeah. So I think this segues into, let me just put a little bookmark in here. I think this does segue for me into kind of what is the future of the comics industry. I think this is a good segue. So what do you think is the future of the comics industry, and is it related to what you're doing right now with some of your projects, which you can go into?
I wouldn't be so bold as to predict what the future of the entire industry is going to look like. There are some interesting things that are happening, I guess, right now. I guess I can talk about a few of them that are potentially factors or at least variables. The first was that about a year and a half ago, as a part of the AT&T Warner Media, just all of it, merger, takeover, however you want to phrase it, or however it is technically classified, a big portion of DC Comics was laid off. And so that was the first kind of, well, not the first, actually, it was the second kind of domino in COVID. The first domino was that when the shelter-in-place order went into place in New York, Diamond Distributors, who are our single distributor in the industry, really since what I was describing earlier about Marvel in the 90s and bankruptcy years, they had a shelter-in-place order, so they weren't shipping books, and so and they weren't able to pay because they weren't getting paid from stores. But stores aren't. Look, we all lived through it, so we know all the probably you can imagine a lot of the complicating factors that have a trickle-down effect where it's like, okay, if the distributor can't get content to the stores don't have new content to sell, right. We as creators aren't getting, we were afraid we might not, or if you're Marvel DC, we were getting pencil down orders on certain books, on a lot of books, because they don't have income coming in because the distributor's not paying them because the distributor's not getting income from the stores. And it's this huge problem. But what kind of started happening was it was interesting. It was interesting to watch. It was a direction I was kind of already heading, but some things take longer for some creators than others. So there are creators like Scott Snyder and James Tynan, two of my very, very good friends, really kind of some of the biggest creators in the industry right now. They saw what was happening and they started focusing on creator-owned world and space for not only themselves, but for other creators as well. And, Scott launched his company, Best Jacket Press, and James has his Tiny Onion Studios. The way creator-owned comics work are you create, you own as the creator, or at least that's how they're supposed to work.
The intellectual property, yes, the art, the everything that goes behind it. So that's the main distinction here.
So what you're making as far as money goes, what you're making is royalties, but royalties are contingent on the book selling. So really you're betting on yourself. There are all sorts of publishers that do creator-owned books. Most of them, in my opinion, are not good deals because they're not actually creator-owned. They're like creator co-owned. You're co-owning it with the publisher and you're co-owning it small page rate, but they're going to publish it and they want to be, a lot of these companies just want to be movie producers. And so even though you co-own it with them, they have business control, which means they can go out and sell or set up an adaptation of the book, for example, and they don't need you involved in it.
I didn't know that. That's interesting. That's definitely a wrinkle there.
The best deal in comics is with Image. It's, again, everything you create, you own. The publisher, Image, does not own anything. I mean, it's why I do all my creator-owned books there. James had a book, The Department of Truth, that did very, very well at Image. He's got a bunch of creator-owned books. He has some at Boom. He has some at Image. He has one at DC.
Can you give us a few numbers? What's very well and what's bad?
I don't have number. I don't have. Well, okay.
Not for his comic, but in general, what's a low selling comic? What's a high selling comic for independent and then for big two?
Or what's a break even?
That's different for every publisher, and I'm not going to get numbers from Marvel as far as what the P&L statement looks like, on the book. So I would say on average, a good kind of ballpark figure to keep in mind for what the best selling book in the industry does is usually about 100,000 copies a month. It's usually like Batman, a really big superhero series. The Walking Dead was consistently, if not the best selling book each month. It was in the top few. Some months you'll get things that launch really big, but there's also I think Spawn 300 did like 300,000 copies or 400,000 copies, like something insane. But it was also now the longest running independent comic book of all time that, you got to an issue number 300. No one had done that before. And Todd's been involved with it pretty much the whole time, if not the whole time. So you understand for a milestone event, like how those numbers that's an outlier. Right. As far as I would say that Marvel, DC, etc., if your book's selling 40,000 copies at Marvel or DC, you're doing pretty good. If you are launching a creator-owned book, it depends on the publisher. The same book launched at two different publishers would often sell differently. You don't see that happen, right? That's more of a thought experiment, but just from my experience and seeing how things have launched and where they launched, I don't want to, necessarily call out certain publishers or anything like that, but a book launching at Boom or Aftershock or Vault is typically going to be in one ballpark. And that book at Image, depending who the creators are, might be, a much bigger book. But on the flip side, there are plenty of Image books that launch that haven't, don't launch. They're not blowing the doors off the sales chart. Sure. But when you're doing a book at Image and all the money is coming directly to you as creators, because Image doesn't take a percentage on the floppy books either. They only take a percentage of royalties on the collected edition. Your numbers can be lower, Kyle, to your question. Like, I'll put it this way. An issue of Radiant Black selling 20,000 copies makes me 5 or 6 times what the same issue of Power Rangers selling 20,000 copies would have made me.
Mm-hmm. Right, right.
But it's because we own the book. And so...
on the risk.
Mm-hmm. So, but you'll see, like, I've launched a number of image books that I've written, but also ones that I've edited. So I wasn't writing. And they've launched 15,000 copies, I would say. Cowl was my first creator-owned book at Image in 2014. It's about a superhero labor union in 1960 Chicago. It's based on a short film that I wrote or co-wrote with Alex Siegel, and then I directed in college called The League, which one of you may have not only might be a producer on it, but I believe you're in it.
I'm a dead body, yeah.
You are a dead body. You're the Red Renegade. Cowl launched at like 21,000 copies, I want to say. Radiant Black.
Oh, no, okay.
Radiant Black launched at 70, and after second and third printings, like, we ended up clearing 80,000 for issue 1.
That's impressive. So when a comic book actually goes up in sales over time, that's a really strong indicator.
That doesn't happen. I'm not saying Radiant Black hasn't gone up. Well, it did from issue 9 to issue 10, but issue 10 was a big. Radiant Black is we call it. It's a superhero series for a new generation. Is like I didn't come up with the slogan, but the slogan. Trust me, it's a lot to live up to. It's really, I describe it as like it's Power Rangers with adult problems. So it's like a cross between Invincible, which is a very popular creator-owned superhero that Robert Kirkman and Cory Walker and then Ryan Otley joined later created. There's a big Amazon animated show right now. It's one of my favorite books, which made it very cool that Robert gave us this incredibly generous and gracious pull quote for our launch, which he described Radiant Black as like the perfect superhero comic book for anyone missing Invincible. So he took really big swings with Invincible. The book ran for like 10 to 15 years. In that way, we are kind of hopefully a spiritual successor in the sense, at least from scope and ambition. Like we take some really big swings. So like the thing though is like you have to look at the standard rate of attrition on a comic is typically your issue number 1 is going to launch where it launches. And then you're going to see anywhere from 35 to 55% attrition from issue 1 to issue 2. And then I know Kyle's probably, I can't see him, but I bet his eyes are going wide because now we're talking data sets.
Exactly.
But then from issue 2 to issue 3, you'll have a different rate of attrition. And the hope is that you kind of level out. But the reality is you always are kind of, the numbers go down every issue, but you're just trying to stave that off as best you can. And then hopefully the goal in the creator-owned world, at least as far as I think about it, is like, if I can get to 3 trade paperbacks worth of material, then the back catalog, those collected editions, they start making enough money that like you're making money just on the back catalog, because every new edition you put out ends up refreshing the previous editions in stores' minds, because they're gonna, when a new edition comes out, they're gonna stock up on, if volume 4 comes out, it's like, oh, do we have volume 1 through 3? Oh, let's get a couple copies of volume 1 and a couple of copies 2. And so it's refreshing the back catalog.
Let me do a couple analogies and then shift this conversation a little bit. But yes, when Metallica comes out with a new album, they usually go platinum on all their other albums again. And so they're usually, when they come out with an album, they're usually the top selling artists that year simply because of their back catalog.
Yeah.
And speculators love issue number 1.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And would you say that in terms of the future of the comic books industry,
Actually,
on this, that it's moving towards more creator owned? And I've seen this in other industries too. If you take someone like musicians like Macklemore, they self-published their album and it was a huge hit. Right, they did it. Paid a 12% fee, and that's happening across industries. Do you see that kind of happening more? Is that what you're saying?
If creators are smart, but it goes both ways, because rates aren't going to be great. There is a mutually beneficial exchange in creators working for a Marvel and a DC. Working on established properties, established characters, established brands is a way to boost your own kind of creator profile, so that when you do your own original work that you own, hopefully there's, you have a little bit of hopefully a better shot at attracting an audience, because they have an association with your name, or some readers will have an association with your name, and hopefully, more importantly, store owners, because you wrote Batman or you wrote Nightwing, or you wrote Flash, whatever, right?
Right. New York Times best-selling artist Kyle Higgins. Right?
But then for the companies, for a Marvel or DC, it's beneficial for them to be bringing in this talent because they need to refresh the characters. I mean, these characters have been around for so many years at Marvel and DC. It can be a mutually beneficial kind of exchange. The trouble, and look, like that's Marvel and DC are going to have probably the best rates that you're going to find in traditional work. That's taking out, specialty projects and specialty jobs for like a producers or film studio or whatever, where, they're bringing in essentially like Hollywood money is coming in to try to retroactively proof out something as a comic, that kind of stuff happens still. But Marvel and DC are going to typically be kind of like, that's where your top rates are. The problem is, or not problem, but the caution is, that's a path and I was on it for many years. Like, it's a path that like you can become blinded by because you're associating success with writing Spider-Man or Captain America or the Avengers or the Justice League. And it's like, but because there's that built-in fandom and fan base, from a business standpoint, it's like you can do really well if you go all in on like that route, and there's a desire there both from readers as well as the company to have you, but you'll probably burn out at a certain point because everybody does, we all do. And then you look around and it's like, okay, but of what I created here, what is mine, Right. So as long as you keep that in mind, to me, it's like there is benefit in straddling both worlds. I mean, like Radiant Black doesn't do as well as it is doing if I don't spend 3 years like reinventing Power Rangers as a modern comic book series. So when I do Power Rangers and then I do Ultraman and then I announce and launch Radiant Black, which has similar like aesthetic influence, it helps have that prior work experience and brand association, or at least not brand association, genres.
Well, and as you said, it helps them too, though, because now that you have a successful comic in Radiant Black, right, they can say author of Radiant Black and Nightwing and Power Rangers. Right. So real quick, just to loop back to answer that, because this actually ties up perfectly when I was talking about the Snyder and the James LLC. Like, even though it's conversation, I can't not. It's my narrative instincts, man. I gotta bring it back, and pay off the story. So James and Scott and other creators were doing this as well. They're looking around, going, okay, yes, like Scott was a huge writer at DC. James was a huge writer at DC as well. And James put out an announcement a few months ago, which was that he was going to partner with Substack as a part of a new initiative that they had for comics creators. Ooh. And he was going to be doing comics that were exclusively available through his Substack behind a subscription wall. And there was a grant that Substack was paying. It was so good that James was announcing that he was leaving Batman, and he was only going to be doing his creator-owned work. And he's kind of built out, the beginnings of an empire, and it's awesome to see. And so the Substack stuff, and there are a bunch of creators that have Substack deals right now, and everybody's kind of trying to figure out how to make it work. I think how to release books that way, but the actual deal with Substack is and I don't have one, but my understanding of it is that it is quite good, specifically with regards to IP. They're not going to touch your IP. They want your audience on their platform. So that's really interesting right now. Even if it doesn't end up working, maybe the next one that it has inspired does. It's the first time someone's really tried this in the industry, and pretty much every creator took notice. Even if they don't agree with it and don't want to head down that, head down that path, they're aware that it's going on. Well, I have to say some of my favorite journalists are on Substack.
Yep, I use Substack. I mean, I have a company now that we launched out of Radiant Black. It's called Black Market Narrative, and it's basically it's a creative collective. You can go to blackmarket.la, and the tagline is that we build universes. And so it's my favorite part and what I love about making comics and why I've been doing it full time for 10, 11 years now is the collaboration and I've met so many great writers and creators and artists over the years, and behind the scenes I've helped with a number of books and getting them, I've walked a number to image personally, And so just things I believed in. And so thought, as we're doing Radiant Black and all this other kind of slate of stuff I've been building, let's put it behind something of a hub. And there is so much kind of cross-medium storytelling that we're doing now because we have this hub, and also because as a creator-owned property or projects, there's no one to tell us no. So we can kind of do whatever we want. And I mean, Brad, for as long as you've known me, how many different arenas have I dabbled in over the years with regards to everything from post-production to video game writing to sound editing to voice directing to live action directing. Like, this is a way to kind of, this is the most creatively fulfilled I've felt in a very long time. I'm stressed out of my mind, but very creatively fulfilled. So
I really like a lot of the cross promotion that you're doing and having characters have their own Twitter handles. And, I think that.
And that's all in universe.
Right. We talk about like the future of the comic books industry. I think that this, like you said, there's many aspects to that conversation, but this is certainly one of them, is the not necessarily cross promotion, but creating a bigger world that goes beyond the comic book. And I think that's a really cool concept. So let's talk, let's shift this conversation a little bit just to hit some quick questions. I know we're running out of time. One, can you see yourself using auto generation of art? Let's say you were to write the story and then you describe the picture the way you want to see it. And if it could draw it like Todd McFarlane, would you do that? Or whatever your favorite artist is, because there are capabilities now where you can feed a data set like all of Todd McFarlane's comics into AI, and it will be able to generate images from the written word. So
no, I don't have any interest in that personally, but I'm also somebody that's going to go shoot his first feature on 35 millimeter film. So like there is something that I find that is slightly unquantifiable about anything analog and even digital art when it is being, when you're drawing on a Cintiq, on a Wacom, whatever, like this is an expression of someone making choices. And I don't know about you, but I feel like there are enough fucking robots making choices for me in my day-to-day life. I have no interest in that. I'm also in a different position, though. Like, if I were starting out and I couldn't afford an artist, but I really want to make comics, look, pages and artists and good art is a big barrier of entry to the comic book industry, because no one, as a writer, no one wants to read your script. No one's going to read your script. They want to read your comic. So the advice we always give is you have to make comics. You find an artist, whether you find them and team up online or you meet at a convention or at a panel like the one that I usually give this kind of talk on. Even just starting small with 1-pagers or 5-pagers or 8-pagers, not only is that better from a narrative standpoint to begin with, rather than planning an 800-page epic, but financially it's more viable because a good artist is not going to work for free, and your comic is only as good as the collaboration with the artist and the art. Through that lens, just to play devil's advocate against myself, there's some benefit there to auto-generate stuff, but I don't think it's the answer to the question that no one's asking. It's just not interesting to me.
That makes sense. And just as a plug for those who don't know, Kyle Polich, data scientist, AI specialist, can you tell us what the state of that is right now in brief?
Oh, it's startling. There's been some recent breakthroughs, and it's really the bleeding edge of where computer vision is going. But this past year in particular, we've seen a couple major advancements. A good Google image search is for Avocado Chair, and you'll find a list of, some very inspired abstract concepts of what an avocado chair could be, and those are all computer generated. We're in an era where it's feasible that maybe a comic book could hit the shelves that was totally computer drawn. Maybe a sensational reveal of that later. It's not where you'd see through it for sure right away. The technology's getting pretty advanced, but my prediction is it'll just become a new tool that some artists will pick up and use in their own way.
Right. Okay. And so, Kyle, one other question. This is the reverse side of this. Auto generation of art is one thing, but do you ever see AI generating like a moving comic story? So it's one thing to generate a story. We know AI can do that, but I know you're a comic book writer, not an AI specialist, but you do create stories that are moving, that speak to people, that go beyond just the basic words, right? And connect to some emotion. Do you see AI, being able to do that in your mind? And and how will that affect you? I mean,
I guess I don't know why. I just don't know why anyone wants that. And maybe that is really myopic and caveman of me, but I just don't get it. I mean, I sit through a lot of Marvel movies despite enjoying them, and all I feel like is it's the exact same thing, and they all look exactly the same, and they are all so designed almost down to a formula. I agree with the Martin Scorsese, like their amusement park rides. I don't mind that. I enjoy amusement park rides. I enjoy that experience. But that experience is consistent because it needs to be consistent. And as a result, it all feels sterile to me. So I'm not interested in anything that, I mean, you're saying, can a computer create a moving story? Okay, but why do we need that? I guess is what it comes back to, you know? Right. I mean, I guess it's fascinating. I mean, sure, I guess it can do it. I mean, but that just sounds like a further, shitty dystopian cyberpunk reality that we're already heading towards. Right. That well, I don't want to be in. But so if a robot can write a story for me about how the world is not going to be that, I might be into that story. Actually.
Right. So if you take the two, generating art and generating stories, you could see a flood in the industry of.
What if AI eventually starts creating stories explaining to us? No, don't worry, we're not going to overtake you.
Exactly, and it's they're programming us and priming us.
It's like the film in Don't Look Up, where it's like the robots are creating propaganda comics to try to like explain to us. No, it's all good. Like don't worry. Like just embrace your new overlords.
Okay, a couple quick questions at the end. Like, what's your favorite comic lately? Well,
I just read. I should have read it many years ago, but I just read over the summer Miracle Man for the first time, and I loved it. I like it more than Watchmen.
Oh wow, I'll read it.
Yeah, I don't know that I would have if I read it 20 years ago, maybe, but Invincible, I read for the first time about a year ago, and 2 years ago. God, this COVID brain. Sorry. Department of Truth is great. James's book, Something's Killing the Children, is great. Snyder, to stay on that train of thought, his first issue for this book, Clear, I loved, with Francis Manapul.
Is that through Substack?
No, that one's through Comixology, and you guys would like it. It's an idea. It's funny. I had a similar idea. I told Scott, I was like, this is how much I love your book. I can't ever do my idea now, and I don't care because I love what you did with this. Coincidentally, like so much. But it's a world where, you can reskin in AR, basically, the world to look however you want it as you move through it. I guess it's not technically AR. I don't know what is that. What someone just corrected me the other day that said, well, you're talking about is XR, where there's physical interaction, and I was like, I thought that's what AR was, but
that's new to me.
That's new to me too. It's AR to me.
That's what I thought it was too. So I guess you know what? I'm going to take your guys' word for it over. I don't even remember who told me it. So. I'm glad to know that that's not necessarily the case.
All right. And then what about movies? What are your favorite movies lately?
I really liked the new Matrix.
You did?
I loved it.
Really?
I loved it. Yeah.
I watched it and I thought it was tough.
Yeah, no, I really liked it. This is a way longer conversation. I'm not even arguing that it's a good movie. It's bold, and I just think it's so metal in so many ways.
And meta, it's got this whole metaverse thing.
Well,
yeah.
I mean, I said metal, but it is also obviously incredible.
Oh, I know you said metal, but yes, it's. Yeah. I think there's interesting ideas in it.
Yeah,
I loved within a movie,
Yep, and I loved Don't Look Up. It's so much fun with that.
That was fun. Yes. Okay, and one last question that I didn't get to, which is, when we get into a world where VR is more and more real. Personally, I don't dabble in it. But we're getting into the what everybody's calling Web 3, which is really loosely defined. Do you see young people getting so accustomed to being in like a VR or virtual environment that they're not going to want to bother with real physical comics? Personally, I've seen everybody talk about the demise of print books, and I haven't seen that happen yet. Even though people can read on their iPads left and right.
Oh my God, no, they're completely different audiences and markets, as we've seen over the years. Like people were terrified for many years that digital and iPads and Comixology were going to be the death of print, and that has not been the case at all. In fact, I'm literally, I pulled up before we all jumped on it. There was a year in review article that came out yesterday, actually, from Publishers Weekly, about print books having a huge sales year in 2021. And basically the headline is, led by fiction categories, unit sales of print books rose 8.9% in 2021 over 2020. At outlets that report to NPD BookScan, units sold were 825.7 million last year, up from 757.9 million in 2020. If you scroll down a bit, it says, within adult fiction, the graphic novel genre, that kills me, okay. It's a medium, but sure. I guess, okay, whatever. Within adult fiction, the graphic novel genre had the biggest increase, with units jumping 109.3%, followed by fantasy, which saw sales rise 45.3%. It's such an interesting question because I'm not convinced that it's gonna take in the future, the screen of it all. And maybe it will, and maybe again, we're gonna just end up living in this NFT-driven metaverse where I guess you still have to walk through a shitty version of Walmart, but in VR now. I don't know what that video was the other day, but I guess we could end up there. But at the same time, it's the vinyl thing to me too. There is something that maybe it's just my hope for where we're headed. I hope that people prioritize the tactile and the real still.
I think it'll always be around, but I think there's room for if we just talk about growth in general, if you're combining digital and physical, that, young people might be more okay with the digital, and they might be in their VR environment and unlock or pay for a comic book and be reading it in their VR environment, which they're still reading. They're just not reading the physical book.
And what's funny is that even saying all that, so much of what I'm super excited about and exploring through Black Market Narrative, but also Radiant Black, and you alluded to this with the Twitter accounts that we have that are in universe and stuff. I'm very, very into immersive storytelling. It's funny because you would think if you're just telling a story, if you were telling a story fully in a metaverse world, you could really how there's nothing more immersive than that. But for me, it's interesting. I like immersion in different mediums, playing to the strengths of what those mediums are. And then those experiences all add up for something larger. I would love to do something in VR for Radiant Black, but I would also design that experience to be something that was additive to the narrative that I'm doing. Maybe it isn't an adaptation. Maybe it's an original story that actually is in universe, but people are experiencing it differently. So that stuff I'm super into, but I think it's immersion rather than physical immersion.
All right, Kyle. So after talking to Kyle Higgins, is there any difference in your opinion, or what stuck out to you in terms of the comic book industry and the future of it, and whether or not comics are dead?
I guess for me, my biggest takeaway was my misconception that it was an industry in slight decline. I guess maybe the way I experienced it was, as the Wednesday floppy goer, but the medium's branching out in a lot of formats, graphic novels, OGN, and, Comixology, I think we mentioned. And so there's some growth. Maybe it doesn't spike when the movie comes out, but you can't disconnect these things. And it sounds like they're showing year-over-year growth and serious numbers. So not dead at all.
Yeah, I think for me it was actually quite surprising as well. The first number that popped up was it's a roughly $1.1 billion industry in terms of total sales. And that's a big industry.
Yeah.
Right. And then, of course, also his citing of year-over-year growth, which was also impressive. I think the important thing here is that the industry is shifting and doing a lot more, I wouldn't call it cross-promotion, but different ways to consume have probably helped that industry quite a bit. You would think that being able to consume digitally would have consumed some of the numbers of the floppies of the traditional, handheld comic books. But it doesn't appear that way. It seems like both are increasing. And definitely the interest in comics is bigger than I thought it was. So, it didn't change my opinion about them going away because I didn't think they were ever going away. But I was surprised to learn how robust it actually is.
Yeah. And how significant the creator-owned portions are.
Yeah, I didn't realize that Substack was doing a comic books for creators. So that tells you that there's a market there, that Substack saw the market, and it stands to reason. They're a subscription print service, really. Not print, but digital consumption service. And it stands to reason that they would do it. And it's really great that they don't take any of the intellectual property. I also found it surprising that Image Comics is really the best. They don't take any of the intellectual property, and they don't even take any of the print money. They take it in graphic novel format or collected format. Isn't that what he said?
I'd have to rewind to know exactly, but I'm aware that Image is the place to go if you're an established person in comics industry. That's all the creator-owned stuff is there, or all the best, or it's the flagship deal.
Well, I wonder how Substack is going to deal with wanting physical copies. That's an interesting ancillary part of Substack. Are they going to print them on demand or anything like that? I guess only time will tell.
I think Substack's purely digital, and I don't see that changing.
It is right now, but if you're a comic book writer, you don't want to just do the digital format on Substack, right?
So collect it.
I would think that you would want to collect it and put it out, and maybe they just say you could do that if you want to. You just have to do it through somewhere else.
There's a big possibility that could work. I could see that being the new face of how comics get broadly consumed in the future, possibly.
Yeah, I mean, generally, though, I think there's this cutting out of the middleman, so to speak, or at least a shifting of who the middle person is. It used to be very much a three-step process. Go to a publisher, you would have your story, you would go to one of the big comic books makers, Marvel, DC, you would write for them, then they would go to a distributor, and the distributor would distribute it. Now it's kind of like you're skipping that and just going straight to the distributor. In this case, Substack or Comixology, as they were saying. So there's a little bit of that cutting out of the middleman.
Definitely, yeah.
Which seems to be a trend across industries. It's good to see. It's a fun conversation.
For sure.